So the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, which before they would say, well, no, can't be, and now you see not only they talking for it, isn't let's see, who's the recent one that's starlet? I'm trying to think of her name. Angelina Jolie.
Angelina Jolie,
our latest and greatest.
Yes.
And
by the
Michelle?
way, she's a big supporter of the UN. Jolie. Yeah.
Well, the UN, the whole world government thing. These people get together and they say, like you were saying, not only can we, how can we start wars? How can we control the mind of the people? So, with these really rich elitists like the Harrimans, okay, like the Carnegie Foundation, would they have funded many of the universities? Would they have funded the studies that the universities did?
That's right.
Would they study? Would they but would they fund mind control studies? You know, have elitists ever done stuff like that?
So what I tell folks is that when you read this book, you will never look at the news with the same set of eyes again, because you'll have a better understanding of the folks telling you the news, who's motivating them, why they're motivated this way, and so to me this is an indispensable book. It's a history of the Council on Foreign Relations, the history of the United States of the 20th century.
Excellent.
So
the shadows
of power, and it's available, almost easy to get.
Oh no, it's in the library systems.
Now, this book, Philip Drew, Administrator, this was originally published in 1912, written by a man named Colonel Edward Mendel House. Now, the Colonel was an honorary title.
Name.
It was an honorary title. He was not a military man.
Is that like Dr. Henry Kissinger?
Well,
he got his doctorate for giving a speech
He may have a
at Harvard.
doctorate degree. Yeah. Does he have an honorary degree? I thought he had a doctorate out of Harvard. I'm not certain. Though,
I believe he gave a speech and received a doctorate.
I wouldn't want to get an inoculation from him, though, I'll tell you that, or I'd take my temperature.
Was it not Kissinger Associates, which was the first employment of Barack Hussein Obama Barry Soetoro, out of college, his very first job?
And by the way, Kissinger belongs to this organization.
Right, exactly. I mean, so do we tie him together now? How many previous presidents were members of the CFR?
Well, they go back to the first president, we believe, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
So many of our presidents have been members of the CFR.
Yes.
And they laugh.
John Kennedy was supposed, his name never showed up on the roster, but he was supposed to be a member. Nixon was a member. Ford was a member.
Right, I remember that.
Jimmy Carter was a member. He was a member of the Trilateral Commission, which is an international offshoot. George H.W. Bush
H.W. Daddy Bush, the son of Prescott Bush.
Yes, that's
the
right.
same individual who had his assets frozen in 1942 for trading with the enemy, being a banker for the Nazis in this case.
Oh, but don't worry about anything, because when the war ended, all the assets were released.
Exactly. It was like 1950 something.
What makes it, and it's point. I think it's mentioned in this book too that IT&T had vast holdings in Nuremberg. The only building they didn't bomb in Nuremberg was the ITT building. And in the early 60s, the ITT sued the U.S. government for damages it did to their interest in Germany, and they won. And that didn't cover much. But we're going a little bit beyond
after the noise thing, I wanted to go into one other thing, and that is my father, being a General Electric employee, told me that during the entire Second World War, General Electric had 16 plants in Germany. Not once were they bombed.
That's not surprising to me either.
Now, we did bomb Dresden. I remember that. I remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, the big bombing, the 1,000 plane raids and all this stuff. But the other thing with the Council on Foreign Relations, boy, when I think of that, all I think of is David Rockefeller and the Rockefellers, you know?
Interest, right. Anyway, this book was again, a novel, and it was a futuristic novel. Philip Drew was a military guy who ended up becoming the dictator of the United States. And the author of this book, Edward Mendel House, who, by the way, ended his last years in Gloucester, Magnolia, Massachusetts. He was to Woodrow Wilson that Kissinger was to Nixon. But he wasn't, well, Kissinger had a big ego, and Kissinger was a household name. He was out in the public a lot. He wasn't, although he lived in the White House right next to him. And Wilson
That's
said,
why I remembered the name.
Yeah, Wilson said, I didn't make any move without his approval or without his say-so. And he said basically he was my alter ego, my other self. Mr. House had a contempt and a disdain for the U.S. Constitution. And when you read the novel, actually it's an interesting read. I mean, it reads like a good novel, a good story. What he advocates is pretty rotten. It's still an interesting read. One of the things is that Philip Drew, this administrator, this dictator, would have fireside chats, you see. Well, does that sound familiar, fireside chats?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. When Franklin Roosevelt got the nomination for president, and at the Democrat convention, I believe it was in Chicago in 1932, he made it. He came back to the east. He made a little side trip to Magnolia, Massachusetts, a little town, a little section of Gloucester, and he met an ailing house, probably on his
Mental house,
deathbed,
yep.
and he probably said something like, "Hey, we're back in business."
Well, it's rather interesting because when you the analogy that with Mendelhouse anyway and Wilson was responsible for signing what the income tax law, okay, and also the Federal Reserve Act.
That's right. Federal
Which
Reserve
created
Act.
a private banking cartel to create our currency, something Thomas Jefferson told us not to do, okay, but also too, it created a banking cartel that could make profit and not pay taxes. And this was all done what? They voted on it, wasn't it December 22nd or 23rd?
1913.
When everybody was going. So
He gave us World War One.
yeah,
Well, he didn't give us
Wilson.
World War
And
One.
Wilson
He got us our
apologized.
involvement in World War
Yeah.
One. Gave us the inheritance tax too. Those were all planks of the Communist
Interesting.
Manifesto, all
Yes,
about
yeah,
the same time.
3 of the 10. Yeah.
I mean, you should be able to pass your wealth off to anybody without paying these
Well-
ridiculous taxes. But if you have a big foundation where all your money's going to, you don't worry about it. But the average person doesn't have these.
The question for the viewers is, do they have the right to personal property? Like you say, if something's mine and I want to give it to my son, this jacket,
That's right.
I should be able to without having to pay anybody any tax. The other thing is their labor. Do the viewers own their own labor? See, we've given up that whole mindset, whereas America was founded by individuals who said, you have the right to personal property. Your labor is yours.
That's right.
And so Woodrow Wilson, and this Mendelhouse person who you'd mentioned, huge influence on him. Huge. And what was done to the American people then, okay? Even though it wasn't rolled out right then, a lot of that stuff was very, very, I want to say, I'm talking too much, but it was very slow. It was slow coming.
Well, a book like this
very
wasn't
gradual.
known. This wasn't in the New York Times bestseller list, but it was a book read by the elitists. Franklin Roosevelt's mother gave him one for his birthday. And it's books like Looking Forward, or Looking Backward by Bellamy.
Yeah.
These
okay.
were things that were very influential for the socialists back in the 1880s. This was a book that was the next, 30, 40 years after that, looking backwards, which I've read. It was a very interesting.
Good read?
It is a good read. It's a futuristic novel that deals with a socialist country, and but it is interesting read. But these are the kinds of books. Books and ideas have consequences. That's why Karl Marx wrote a manifesto, or at least plagiarized a manifesto. That's why Looking Backward was published. That's why this book was published. That's why a lot of books are published, because they do have impact on people. So these are two books that I recommend. They sort of work together. They're both important books.
You also
And
have a very
this one's out of print, and these are available very inexpensively too. I mean, you can find them on Amazon, for next to nothing. There's another interesting book, The Rockefeller File, by Gary Allen. We were talking about Rockefeller a little bit here and there. Now, I just started an Amazon account, and tell you what, people love this book. And this book was published in 1975-76, and more people are starting to realize the influence that these folks have, and they're interested in what Gary Allen was the author. He's deceased now. He died in 1988. He was a relatively young man, but he wrote None Dare Call It Conspiracy. It was one of the earliest mass-produced books exposing the globalist agenda, and it was co-authored by a man named Larry Abrams, by the way, who are still writing. Over 6 million copies of this book were distributed. We didn't know. We can't say we sold 6 million, but some people would buy a case, at a wholesale price and give them out.
Yeah.
And today, this book is in big demand. None Dare Call It Conspiracy. You go to Amazon, and they're going for $10, $15 a copy.
I actually remember the name Gary Allen. I believe I've actually read None Dare Call It Conspiracy. The Rockefeller File, though. Tell us a little bit about
Well, this book was sort of a maybe, what do you call it, a second volume of None Dare Call It Conspiracy. It goes into the history of the Rockefeller family, from John D. Sr., a little bit about John D. Sr.'s father, but he wasn't a key player. John D. Sr. up until the brothers Rockefeller. There's one still living, it's David.
David, right.
He's in his mid-90s, I believe, but Winthrop and...
I want to say Nicholas and Nelson Aldrich.
Nelson
Let's
Aldrich,
not
who
leave
became
Nelson.
vice president.
Now,
And of
why
course-
is his name important? Tell the viewers about Nelson Aldrich.
Well, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller became vice president under Gerald Ford,